I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. The idea had been simple. Escape the city, leave behind the noise, the stress, and the unending obligations, and spend a few days in the wilderness, alone, with just my backpack, my tent, and the forest around me. I had chosen a remote spot in the northern woods, a place I had scouted months earlier while hiking. The forest was dense, and the area was far from any road or trail that I had seen on the map. It was perfect for solitude, for immersion in nature. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small camping stove, enough food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a flashlight with extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a multipurpose knife. I even packed some matches in a waterproof case. I left my phone in the car, knowing that the cell service was non-existent there anyway. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning. The sky was a clear blue, and a cool breeze drifted through the trees. I shouldered my backpack and began walking, following the narrow dirt path that led deeper into the woods. At first, the forest felt alive in the most ordinary sense. Birds sang quietly, insects buzzed, and the occasional squirrel darted across my path. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a mixture of pine and damp soil. I kept a steady pace, taking care to watch my footing on the uneven trail. As the hours passed, the forest began to feel less familiar, less welcoming. The trail narrowed, branches scraping against my shoulders, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I noticed that the signs of human presence, the small trail markers I had relied on, the occasional footprints in the dirt, became scarce. I knew the campsite I had intended to reach was supposed to be about 3 miles further, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. I tried not to panic, but a tiny knot of unease had formed in my stomach. Finally, as the sun began its slow descent, I reached a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The area seemed isolated, untouched. The ground was soft, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. I decided this would be my camp for the night. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure, and gathered firewood from the surrounding forest. The woods were quiet now, much quieter than I had expected. The sounds of birds had faded, and even the stream seemed subdued. By the time I had a small fire going, the sun had set, and the forest had fallen into near darkness. I cooked a simple meal over the flames, listening to the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. That night I slept lightly. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind brushing through the trees, an animal scurrying in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. My mind tried to rationalize every noise, telling myself it was just nature. But sleep was shallow, broken by small, inexplicable sounds that made me jerk awake. The next morning, I woke early, determined to follow the stream to see if it led to a more familiar area. The air was crisp, and the dew had soaked everything. I packed my belongings carefully, making sure not to leave anything behind. The first hours of the day went smoothly. The sun was higher now, and the forest looked less intimidating in daylight. But as I moved further along the stream, I noticed something unsettling. The terrain began to change. The trees grew taller and denser, their trunks thick with moss. The underbrush thickened, making every step more difficult. The trail I thought I could follow became almost non-existent, swallowed by nature. By midday, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. I could no longer see the clearing where I had camped. Panic started to creep in. I had maps, but the dense canopy above distorted my sense of direction. The stream, which had been a guide, seemed to twist and turn unpredictably. I kept moving, hoping to find a recognizable landmark, but the forest seemed endless. As the afternoon wore on, the forest changed again. The stream narrowed into a trickle, and the ground became uneven and rocky. Shadows grew longer even under the midday sun. I began to notice tracks in the mud, large, deep impressions that I couldn't immediately identify. At first, I thought they were deer, but the prints were too wide, too heavy. Anxiety began to build. I reminded myself to stay calm, to keep moving, to avoid panicking, but the instinctual feeling of being watched grew stronger. By evening, I was exhausted and increasingly aware of my isolation. I realized I had no choice but to make camp again. I found a small depression in the ground, shielded by overhanging branches, and set up a makeshift shelter with my tarp and supplies. My hands shook as I built a fire, gathering damp wood and kindling. Each crackle of the flames sounded unnaturally loud. I sat close to the fire, scanning the darkness beyond its light. I heard a low rustle in the underbrush. It stopped as soon as I froze. Then the sound began again, closer this time. Something was moving in the forest, and I could not see what it was. I forced myself to rationalize it. A bear, a large deer, maybe a raccoon. But even as I repeated these explanations, fear gnawed at me. Night fell quickly. Darkness enveloped the forest, swallowing even the firelight. The rustling persisted. Every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig, sounded deliberate. I was aware of every muscle in my body, every shallow breath, my heart hammering in my chest. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake all night, fire crackling, ears straining. The sounds never stopped. At times, I thought I glimpsed movement in the shadows, always just beyond the light. Every sense screamed caution, fear, the primal instinct to flee. Yet I was trapped, exhausted, alone, deep in a forest with no clear path out. By the second day, my anxiety reached a point where it dominated my every thought. I moved cautiously, following the stream again, hoping it would lead to a road or trail. I avoided leaving my fire unattended, even for a moment. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to conceal a predator. I realized that in my eagerness to explore, I had underestimated the forest. The sense of isolation, the unpredictability of wildlife, the physical exhaustion, and the mental strain all combined to make the experience terrifying. As I moved through a particularly dense area, I stumbled into a patch of mud. My foot sank, and I struggled to pull it free, slipping and sliding as my pack dragged me down. Panic surged as I realized that if I couldn't move quickly, I might fall or get trapped in deeper mud. I fought to free myself, finally pulling my leg out, clothes and boots caked in sticky soil. Shaking, I looked around. The forest seemed to close in on me. By late afternoon, I came to a steep incline. My legs burned, my energy was nearly gone, but I had no choice but to climb. I grasped roots and rocks, pulling myself up, slipping occasionally, scraping my hands and arms on rough bark. At the top, I collapsed against a tree, breathing heavily. The forest stretched endlessly before me. I considered turning back, but the path behind me had become unrecognizable. The fear of being lost forever gnawed at me, stronger than exhaustion. Night fell again. I had no clear idea of where I was, and the darkness amplified every sound. I built a fire again, more for comfort than for light. I stayed awake, listening. I heard animals moving, branches snapping, something large moving in the distance. I reminded myself, most of the forest creatures were not dangerous, but the fear was visceral. My body remained tense, my mind alert to every movement. On the third day, my desperation increased. I needed water, food, and a way to escape. I moved carefully, following a faint path that seemed to lead downward. The forest slowly thinned, and I began to recognize subtle signs of human activity. Broken branches, a faint trail, a small pile of rocks stacked in a way that seemed intentional. Relief flooded me. I realized I had stumbled upon an old logging trail that might lead to a road. By mid-afternoon, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle in the distance. My pace quickened. The forest opened up into a clearing, and I saw a dirt road winding through the trees. My relief was overwhelming. I ran to the road, collapsed against a tree to catch my breath, and soon saw a truck approaching. I waved frantically. The driver stopped, concern evident. I explained my situation in brief gestures, my voice hoarse and shaking. They offered water, a ride, and directions back to the nearest town. Once back in civilization, the reality of what I had endured settled in. I was exhausted, sore, and deeply shaken. The forest had been beautiful and serene at times, but its isolation, unpredictability, and the constant sense of being alone had made the experience harrowing. The clear ending came not from a dramatic rescue or confrontation, but from survival, caution, and the awareness of my own limits. I had tested myself, faced fear in its purest form, and emerged alive, wiser, and more respectful of the wilderness. I never returned to that campsite. The memory stayed with me, a mixture of awe and terror. I learned that fear can be as real as any physical threat, and that isolation can magnify it beyond measure. And yet, I carried a strange sense of accomplishment. I had entered the forest alone, lost, scared, and I had found my way out. That was the kind of ending that mattered. Not a tale of heroics, but of endurance, attention, and respect for the wilderness. The experience remained vivid in my memory. The dense trees, the sound of the stream, the shadows, the mud, the rocks, the firelight flickering against the darkness, the constant awareness of being alone. I could still feel the tension in my muscles, the pounding of my heart, the icy grip of fear in my chest. And with time, that fear transformed into a lesson, one I carried with me every time I ventured into nature again. Always be prepared, always respect the forest, and never underestimate the power of isolation. I had been planning this camping trip for months, trying to find a break from the noise and pressure of the city. Work had been relentless, and my friends were all tied up with their own lives, so I decided to go alone. I wanted the kind of solitude that only deep wilderness could give. A place where the air smelled of pine and damp earth, where the nights were thick with silence, and the sky stretched wide and empty above me. I packed my gear carefully, checking and double-checking my backpack to make sure I had everything I might need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small stove, some dried food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with spare batteries, a multi-tool, a compass, and a detailed map of the area. I wanted to be ready for anything, though I could not have imagined what would actually unfold. I drove for hours, leaving the city behind. The streets gradually narrowed and twisted through rolling hills, the air getting cooler and heavier with the scent of damp leaves. I took a dirt road leading into the forest, each bump in the unpaved path making my stomach tighten with both excitement and unease. The sun was already low by the time I found a small clearing near a river, the kind of spot I had been looking for. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft sound of water running over rocks. I parked my car and climbed out, stretching stiff muscles from the long drive. I carried my gear to the edge of the clearing and began setting up camp. The ground was firm but uneven, with patches of moss and small stones. I cleared the area as best as I could, spreading a tarp and staking the tent down. I made a small fire ring out of stones and gathered dry twigs and branches for kindling. I felt a sense of accomplishment when the first spark caught and flames flickered in the encroaching dusk. The first night was quiet, almost unbearably so. I had never been alone in a place like this before. The silence pressed down, heavier than I expected. Every small sound, branches snapping, leaves brushing against each other, the distant splash of a fish, sounded magnified. I made myself a simple dinner of canned beans and rice heated over the fire and ate slowly, listening. When the fire died down to embers, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the thin fabric doing little to block the damp chill that seeped from the ground. I told myself that this was what I wanted, what I had come here for. Yet as I lay there in the dark, I felt eyes on me. Not literally, but the kind of awareness you get when the world is empty except for yourself. I told myself it was just the mind playing tricks in the dark, that the forest was not alive in that way. Still, sleep was slow to come. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I packed lightly, leaving most of my supplies at the camp. The forest was thick, with narrow trails I had to push through. Moss covered fallen logs, and the occasional patch of sunlight broke through the canopy in thin beams. Birds called out from high branches, and insects buzzed incessantly. I found an old trail marked faintly by a series of broken branches and worn earth, as if someone had passed this way before. Part of me felt uneasy about following it, but curiosity won. I walked carefully, marking my path as best I could with small rock piles, noting trees with unusual markings, anything that might help me retrace my steps. Hours passed, and I realized the trail led deeper into the forest than I had planned. The terrain was uneven, steep in places, with loose rocks underfoot that forced me to watch each step. I began to feel a creeping anxiety, a sense that I had wandered too far. But I also knew I had to keep going a little further. It was the kind of challenge I had set for myself. By late afternoon, I reached a small ravine with a stream running through it. I knelt to drink some water, careful to filter it with the portable pump I always carried. The air was cooler here, damper, and the sound of running water filled the space around me. I decided this would be a good place to rest before heading back. I sat on a large rock, my back against a tree, and took in the quiet, trying to calm my rising tension. But then I noticed something unusual: tracks in the mud near the water. At first, I thought they were from deer, but the spacing and depth suggested something larger. A bear, maybe. My stomach sank. I had read about bear attacks, about people wandering too far from camp and encountering them unprepared. I felt a sudden urge to turn back immediately, but the path I had come from was now obscured by fallen branches and thick undergrowth. I realized I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The forest felt different here, older, denser, almost suffocating. Shadows stretched long and thin as the sun sank lower, and the temperature dropped rapidly. I turned back the way I thought I had come, moving faster now, heart pounding with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig underfoot, the distant snap of a branch that could have been nothing, or it could have been something watching me. The more I hurried, the more disoriented I became. I had marked my way with rocks and scratches on trees, but I was losing track. Panic started to seep in. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios: getting lost in the dark, running into a bear, falling and injuring myself, no one around to help. I tried to focus on breathing, on keeping calm, but every step felt heavy, uncertain. As darkness fell, I realized I had lost the trail entirely. The forest became a wall of black, and my flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead. I could hear the stream nearby, but the terrain made it impossible to follow easily. My legs were growing tired, my backpack felt heavier than ever, and I started to doubt whether I would find my way back at all. The temperature dropped, and moisture began to collect on my jacket, chilling me through. I kept moving, one careful step at a time, listening for any sound that might guide me. The gurgle of the stream, the rustle of leaves from my original trail, anything familiar. Hours seemed to pass. The forest offered no mercy, and the darkness was absolute. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every sound made my heart leap. Eventually, I found myself in a low area where fog had begun to settle. My flashlight barely cut through it, and I stumbled several times over hidden roots and rocks. I considered staying put until morning, but I was too far from camp and too unsure of the direction. The idea of spending the night in the fog, alone, with no idea where I was, terrified me. I pressed on, moving slowly, carefully, every muscle tensed. Time lost all meaning. The darkness, the cold, and the isolation combined into a weight I had never felt before. My mind went through cycles of hope and despair, constantly calculating risks and chances of survival. I reminded myself that panic would only make things worse. At some point, I noticed a faint glimmer ahead. Heart pounding, I moved toward it. It was a small clearing, barely large enough to set down my pack, but it offered a temporary reprieve. I checked my compass and realized, with relief, that the direction roughly matched the way back to camp. I rested briefly, eating some energy bars and drinking water, trying to regain strength. I waited until I felt my hands and feet stop shaking before continuing. The forest still pressed around me, thick and dark, but at least I had a direction. I forced myself to move steadily, taking note of landmarks. A bent tree, a large boulder, a fallen log shaped like an arch. Little by little, I started to recognize parts of the terrain I had passed earlier. The relief that came with recognition was immense, though tempered by exhaustion and cold. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the glint of my campsite through the trees. The fire ring was empty, but the tent was intact. I dropped my pack with a groan of relief, shaking hands and stiff legs trembling from exertion. I quickly rebuilt a small fire, the warmth and light a balm after hours of near panic. I sat close to it, letting the heat seep into my bones, feeling tears of relief prick my eyes. I had never been so grateful for the simple presence of my belongings, the small pieces of normalcy in an otherwise threatening wilderness. That night, I slept lightly, curled in my sleeping bag close to the fire, listening to the distant sounds of the forest but no longer feeling watched or hunted. My mind was alert but calmer, filled with the knowledge that I had survived a long night of fear and uncertainty. The following days were a mix of cautious exploration and careful camp life. I stayed close to the clearing, always marking my path, always observing the forest for signs of wildlife or hazards. I collected water from the stream, filtered it carefully, and cooked meals over the fire, savoring the routine of survival. I became acutely aware of the sounds, smells, and textures of the forest. The dampness of moss underfoot, the sharp scent of pine, the sudden rustle of a squirrel or bird overhead. The fear that had consumed me on the first night gradually transformed into a respect for the environment, a deep understanding of how easily it could become dangerous if one was careless. I learned to move with intention, to observe before acting, and to prepare for contingencies. Each day, I felt a quiet pride in my self-reliance. By the end of the week, I had grown familiar with the terrain around my campsite. I had mapped the trails in my mind, noted safe places to rest, and understood the patterns of wildlife. I packed up my gear carefully, ensuring I left no trace behind. As I drove away from the clearing, the city skyline visible in the distance, I felt a profound sense of achievement. I had faced the fear of being utterly alone, of being lost, and I had come through it intact. The forest had tested me in ways I had never imagined, but I had met those tests with patience, caution, and resilience. The lessons I took with me were not abstract or romantic. They were practical, visceral, and real. Respect the wilderness, prepare thoroughly, observe constantly, and never underestimate the power of nature. When I returned to my apartment, I unpacked methodically, checking my gear for wear and tear, reflecting on every detail of the trip. I realized how much I had underestimated the wilderness, how easily one could become disoriented, and how sharp fear could cut when survival instincts kicked in. The story I had lived through was terrifying, yes, but it was also empowering. I had come face to face with vulnerability, isolation, and the raw power of the natural world, and I had survived through careful attention, patience, and determination. The forest was indifferent, but I had learned to navigate its challenges, and that knowledge stayed with me. I carried it forward into my life, a reminder that fear can be overcome with preparation, awareness, and calm action. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully picking the location, checking weather patterns, making lists of gear, and mentally preparing for what I hoped would be a quiet weekend in the wilderness. The appeal was simple: escape the city, the noise, the endless buzzing of devices, and spend a few days completely alone in nature. Just me, my backpack, and the forest. I wanted isolation, but not the fantasy of it, the real isolation, where every sound and movement around me was a reminder that I was in the wild, completely dependent on myself. I drove for hours along winding mountain roads, leaving behind small towns that blurred together and fading radio signals that gave way to silence. The further I went, the denser the trees became, towering evergreens and old oaks that seemed to form a natural wall around the roads. I carried a well-used backpack with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothing, food, water, a stove, a first aid kit, a headlamp, and a small but sturdy axe. I also carried a hunting knife strapped to my belt, not because I planned to hunt, but because there is a certain comfort in having a sharp blade close at hand when you are completely alone in the forest. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a river that I had picked out on a map. It was perfect. Flat ground, surrounded by thick trees, and with a view of the water, which reflected the late sun in golds and reds. I parked my car off a barely visible dirt track and stepped out, stretching and letting my lungs fill with the crisp air. The smell of pine was heavy, mixed with damp earth and the faint scent of moss. Birds were calling somewhere above me, but their songs were distant, the forest swallowing most sounds. I set up my tent carefully, choosing a spot slightly elevated above the riverbank, where the ground was firm and dry. I used the tarp underneath to keep moisture out and checked that the stakes were secure. I unpacked my food and stove, preparing a simple meal of rice, beans, and canned vegetables. I ate slowly, deliberately taking in the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves, the far-off cry of an animal I could not see, the steady flow of the river. As darkness began to fall, I lit a small lantern inside the tent, just enough to see, and prepared my sleeping bag. It was my first night alone in the woods, and I realized that isolation was a double-edged sword. There was peace, yes, but also a sharp edge of vulnerability. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. When the wind rustled the branches above me, I could feel my heart tighten, a deep instinctive reaction I could not shake. Somewhere out there, I knew animals moved, perhaps deer or maybe predators. Bears were common in these woods, and though I had made noise as I set up camp to avoid surprising them, I knew the forest didn't care about plans or maps. It existed on its own terms, and I was just a temporary visitor. Sleep was fitful. I kept my headlamp within reach, my knife on my belt, even inside the sleeping bag. The forest felt alive, and not in the cheerful way of a postcard. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the brush made me tense. I listened to the river for long stretches, its white noise both comforting and eerie, a reminder of the vastness of the wilderness around me. Eventually, I drifted in and out of sleep, always half aware of the sounds outside. At dawn, I woke to the soft glow of morning, pale light filtering through the mist that rose from the river. Everything looked different in daylight, less threatening, more real, but the feeling of vulnerability didn't leave. I ate breakfast and decided to explore the area. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick in places, and the riverbank slippery. As I walked, I observed tracks in the mud, deer tracks mostly, but also something larger, perhaps a bear. I froze when I realized the prints led both upstream and downstream, and some were fresh. The thought of encountering a bear was unsettling, but I reminded myself of the precautions I had taken. I had food stored properly in a bear-proof container, and I made sure not to carry food in the tent. The day passed slowly. I hiked along the river, noting the way the light changed in different parts of the forest. Some areas were open, flooded with sunlight, and others were dark, shadowed by thick evergreens. I noticed birds nesting high in the trees, small mammals scurrying in the underbrush, and the occasional fish jumping in the river. I was fully aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning for signs of danger. By evening, I returned to camp, tired but satisfied with the solitude and the rawness of the environment. That night, however, something changed. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible snapping of twigs. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate, slow. My heart rate spiked. I knew immediately that I was not alone. It was not an animal. I had spent enough time in the wild to recognize the difference between a wandering deer and deliberate human movement. Someone was moving toward my camp. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, circling my tent. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, someone looking for shelter, or worse. I remembered the knife at my belt and the small flashlight I had stashed in the tent. I considered my options. Stay in the tent and hope the person passed, or confront them. I decided to stay inside the tent, quietly reach for my flashlight, and prepare for whatever might happen. The footsteps stopped again, very close now. I could hear breathing. Whoever it was had approached the tent and paused, as if listening. I slowly switched on the flashlight, casting a narrow beam through the tent flap. The light caught a figure, partially obscured, hunched, moving deliberately. My pulse raced. The person hadn't seen the beam yet. I slowly unzipped the tent a small amount, enough to slip out quietly if necessary. I decided to make noise, not loud, but enough to assert my presence. I dropped a small rock near the edge of the tent, clattered against the dirt. The figure reacted instantly, moving back, and then ran into the shadows of the trees. I stayed where I was, listening. After a few tense minutes, I realized the person had left. I didn't sleep again that night, instead sitting with the knife and flashlight, listening to the forest and imagining every scenario that could unfold. Morning came, gray and misty. I left the tent cautiously, scanning the perimeter. Footprints in the mud confirmed my fears. Someone had been there, circling the camp. They weren't local hikers. The prints were heavy, purposeful, and in patterns that suggested they had been watching me. I packed up everything quickly, taking extra care to secure my food and valuables. I didn't want to leave any trace that would encourage them to return, but I knew I couldn't stay. I hiked toward the nearest trailhead, keeping to the river but taking detours to stay off obvious paths. Every sound put me on edge. A snapping branch, the splash of a fish, the distant cry of a bird. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small dirt road. Relief washed over me as I realized I wasn't far from civilization. I kept moving, walking until I finally saw my car. It was exactly as I had left it. No one had touched it. I got in and locked the doors, taking a moment to breathe. The drive back was long and silent, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but heavy with awareness. I kept checking the rearview mirror, scanning the edges of the road, hyper-aware of every movement. When I finally reached the town and parked at a gas station, I felt the tension begin to ease. I refilled the tank, bought water, and sat for a while, still alert, still processing. That night, in my own apartment, the events replayed in my mind. I realized that the forest had not been dangerous because of animals or natural hazards. It had been dangerous because of people. The experience left me wary, but also determined. I knew I would camp again, but not without precautions. I learned the importance of checking in with others, of avoiding isolated trails when alone, and of being prepared for not just nature, but other humans who do not share your respect for wilderness or boundaries. The next months, I planned my trips differently. I camped with friends, stayed on well-marked trails, and took extra safety measures. But I never forgot that night. The forest had been quiet and peaceful during the day, but the shadow of a human presence in the night had reminded me that solitude carries its own risks. I understood, finally, that wilderness is not a playground. It is a place of awareness, of respect, and of caution. I survived that night, and the lesson stayed with me. The fear was real, but so was the relief. I never returned to that specific spot near the river. The area remained on my mental map as a place of tension, a place where the forest's beauty was matched by its threat. I continued to camp, but with knowledge born from experience, and every time I set up a tent in the wild, I remembered that night. The snapping twigs, the circling footsteps, the figure in the dark. That memory shaped my approach to the wilderness, making every subsequent trip safer, every precaution meaningful. And in that, I found a new kind of peace, not the naive peace of solitude, but the informed, careful peace of someone who understands both the beauty and the danger of the forest. I had planned the trip for months, counting the days, imagining the quiet of the forest and the slow rhythm of life far from the city. I had been camping before, but this time, I wanted something different. A place that was remote, hard to reach, where I could really be alone with the forest. I packed carefully, checking and rechecking everything. My tent, the sleeping bag, the stove, extra food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, headlamp, batteries, maps, compass. I didn't want to take any chances. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through smaller and smaller roads until I was sure GPS could barely even find me. I parked my car in a small clearing, away from the main road, and started hiking along a narrow, overgrown trail. The forest was dense, trees thick with leaves that muffled the wind and filtered the light so that everything had a greenish tint. The air smelled damp, a mix of pine, moss, and the faint rotting smell of fallen leaves. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound. My own breathing, the crunch of twigs underfoot, louder than it should have been. I hiked for hours, climbing a gentle slope until I found a spot that looked perfect for camping. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines, with a flat patch of earth covered in dry needles. There was a small stream nearby, water clear enough to drink once I treated it. I set up my tent, carefully pegging each corner and testing it for stability. I arranged my gear inside, laying out my sleeping bag and placing the small stove nearby. Everything had its place, everything ready. By the time I had finished, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. I made a small fire, careful to keep it contained within a ring of stones I had gathered. The first crackle of flames brought a sense of satisfaction. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, the smell of cooking food mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. I ate slowly, savoring the silence around me, thinking about the night ahead. The first night was calm. The wind rustled the branches, the stream whispered, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. But even in that calm, I was aware of the forest itself. The way it moved, the way it watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, the heightened senses of being alone. I slept fitfully, dreams punctuated by distant cracking sounds, twigs snapping far away, though I told myself it was probably a deer or a small animal. The next morning, I woke early, the light barely filtering through the trees. I made coffee and packed a small day pack with water and snacks, planning to hike further along a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The forest grew thicker as I went, the trail narrower, sometimes disappearing under fallen leaves. I relied on my map and compass, careful not to stray too far. By late morning, I realized I had gone farther than I expected. The ridge offered a stunning view. The valley below spread out like a patchwork of greens and browns. But something about the isolation began to settle in my chest. The forest was no longer just peaceful. It felt vast, endless. I ate a snack, watching for any movement, and that's when I heard it. A low, distant sound, something between a growl and a moan. I froze, listening. It came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just a bear, or maybe a coyote. The area was known for wildlife, but the sound was unusual, heavier than any animal I had heard before. I tightened the straps on my pack and decided to head back. I retraced my steps, careful, eyes scanning the forest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me tense. The further I went, the louder the sounds seemed to get. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm, a pattern, something following me. By late afternoon, I was back at my campsite. I tried to keep calm, reinforcing the fire ring and checking the tent. I hung my food from a tree, far from the tent, as bears could be a threat. The sun began to drop, and with it came a strange stillness. Even the wind seemed to die down. I stayed alert, sitting close to the fire, listening. That was when I noticed something I hadn't before. The footprints. They were faint in the soft earth near my campsite. Not human, larger than any deer, with a shape I couldn't immediately place. My stomach turned. I spent the night on edge, flashlight in hand, listening to the forest. Every sound made me flinch. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, something brushing against the undergrowth. I barely slept, afraid to close my eyes. I told myself I would leave at first light, not wanting to be here another night. Morning came, but the sense of unease didn't leave. I packed quickly, moving as quietly as I could, but keeping my eyes on the forest around me. The trail was overgrown, harder to follow, but I stayed on it, hoping to reach the car before nightfall. As I hiked, the noises returned, not behind me this time, but all around. Twigs cracking, leaves rustling, faint sounds of movement. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt it. Eyes watching, something moving just out of sight. I kept my walking stick in front, ready to strike, though I wasn't sure what it would do. I told myself again it was likely a bear. That was the only rational explanation. By late afternoon, I was back at my campsite. I tried to keep calm, reinforcing the fire ring and checking the tent. I hung my food from a tree, far from the tent, as bears could be a threat. The sun began to drop, and with it came a strange stillness. Even the wind seemed to die down. I stayed alert, sitting close to the fire, listening. That was when I noticed something I hadn't before. The footprints. They were faint in the soft earth near my campsite. Not human, larger than any deer, with a shape I couldn't immediately place. My stomach turned. I spent the night on edge, flashlight in hand, listening to the forest. Every sound made me flinch. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, something brushing against the undergrowth. I barely slept, afraid to close my eyes. I told myself I would leave at first light, not wanting to be here another night. Morning came, but the sense of unease didn't leave. I packed quickly, moving as quietly as I could, but keeping my eyes on the forest around me. The trail was overgrown, harder to follow, but I stayed on it, hoping to reach the car before nightfall. As I hiked, the noises returned, not behind me this time, but all around. Twigs cracking, leaves rustling, faint sounds of movement. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt it. Eyes watching, something moving just out of sight. I kept my walking stick in front, ready to strike, though I wasn't sure what it would do. I told myself again it was likely a bear. That was the only rational explanation. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. My legs ached, my pack felt heavier, and the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The sun was low, shadows long, and I realized I had lost the trail. Panic started to rise. I stopped, breathing hard, looking for any sign, any marker. That's when I saw it. A fallen tree that shouldn't have been there, a rock that looked out of place. The landmarks didn't match my map. I was lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The forest was dense, the trees tall and uniform. The sound followed me, subtle at first, then louder, like something was moving through the trees, keeping pace. My heart pounded. I didn't know if it was a person, a wild animal, or just my imagination, but every instinct screamed danger. I stumbled over roots, scraped my legs on branches, and finally, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I found a small clearing. I could make a temporary camp here, no choice. I cleared a patch of earth, lit a small fire with trembling hands, and sat close to it, listening. The sounds were all around, circling. I stayed awake all night, fire between me and the dark, adrenaline keeping me alert. The next morning, I decided I had to move quickly. I picked a direction I thought led downhill, reasoning that the car was likely in the valley. I kept moving cautiously, until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. More footprints, larger and fresher, leading in the same direction I was going. They weren't animal prints, not entirely. The shape was ambiguous, claw-like, but not precise. Whoever or whatever was here was following. I moved faster, adrenaline giving me strength, but my legs were tired, my mind exhausted. Then, as the sun climbed, I saw the road through a break in the trees. Relief surged through me. I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. The sound behind me faded as I approached the road, the safety of civilization finally within reach. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. The forest receded in the rearview mirror, beautiful and terrifying at once. I kept driving, not stopping until I reached a small town, safe among people. Later, I went back to the ranger station near the trailhead. I told them about the sounds, the footprints, the way I felt followed. They listened, took notes, and explained that the area had reports of a large, unusually aggressive bear that had been wandering off its usual range. It had attacked several deer and one hiker had been scratched but survived. The footprints I had seen matched descriptions they had, but no one could explain the sound or the sense of being watched as intensely as I had felt. I left that forest knowing I had survived because I stayed alert, trusted my instincts, and kept moving. I had seen how fragile safety could be in the wilderness, How quickly comfort turns into danger when you are alone and unprepared for the unexpected. I never went back. I still think about it, the way the trees seemed to move just beyond my vision, the footprints in the soft earth, and the sound that echoed in the night. It was terrifying, real, and I survived. But the memory of that isolation and fear remains as clear as the day I left the forest. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After weeks of long shifts and endless city noise, I needed to escape into the wilderness, to sleep under the stars, to feel the quiet weight of nature around me. I had chosen a remote area in the northern mountains, a place with a reputation for being isolated but beautiful, with dense pine forests, steep ridges, and a lake tucked away in a valley. I had read some trip reports, maps, and online notes, but it was still a place few people visited. That sense of isolation was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had a sturdy tent, warm sleeping bag, food for a week, a first aid kit, extra water, and a compass, plus some small comforts like a book and a camera. I double-checked everything, then loaded it into my old, dusty backpack and set out early one morning, taking the winding mountain roads until I reached the trailhead. The trail started easy enough. I followed a narrow dirt path lined with thick pine needles, breathing in the sharp, clean smell of the forest. The sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, and the occasional bird call made the morning feel alive but peaceful. I was alone, and I liked it that way. I could hear the distant hum of a creek, see the occasional chipmunk dart across the trail, and feel the crisp breeze on my face. I walked for hours, my pack heavy but manageable, stopping occasionally to rest and take photos of sunlit trees or the rocky slopes that opened into small clearings. I followed the map carefully, making mental notes of landmarks. A large fallen log here, a small cluster of rocks there, a thin footbridge over a shallow stream. By midday, I found a spot for lunch on a large flat rock overlooking a small ravine. I ate slowly, savoring the isolation and the quiet, noticing the way the light moved across the pine trunks, the way the wind whispered through the leaves. After lunch, I continued deeper into the forest. The trail became less obvious, and the trees grew closer together. I had to step carefully over exposed roots and loose stones. The further I went, the more I realized just how far from civilization I was. There were no cars, no distant voices, no signs of human presence beyond the trail itself. It was invigorating but also a little unnerving. Around mid-afternoon, I came to a stream that cut across the path. I knew from my map that the lake I planned to camp at was still a few miles further, so I crossed carefully, testing the rocks to make sure they were stable. My boots slipped once, and I nearly lost my footing, but I caught myself and moved slowly, feeling the cold water rush past my ankles. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I had imagined, tucked into a shallow valley surrounded by steep, forested slopes. The water was calm, reflecting the sky in a perfect mirror. I scouted the shoreline and found a flat area just a few yards from the water, surrounded by tall pines that could provide some shelter from wind and rain. I set up my tent quickly, anchoring it to rocks where the soil was soft. The effort left me sweaty and tired, but there was a satisfaction in seeing my small camp take shape. I gathered firewood from the surrounding forest, making sure it was dry and manageable, then started a small fire in the pit I cleared. The smell of burning pine filled the air. I cooked a simple meal over the flames: canned beans, rice, and a little jerky, then washed the dishes in the lake, careful to dispose of the water far from the shore to avoid disturbing the environment. As evening fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in a fleece and sat by the fire, watching the light fade and the shadows lengthen. The forest grew dark and dense, and the sounds of wildlife became more noticeable. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the occasional splash in the water. I felt a mixture of peace and unease. It was beautiful but also intimidating in its isolation. I decided to get some rest early, planning to hike more the next day. I crawled into my sleeping bag as the fire burned down to embers, feeling the familiar ache in my muscles from the day's hike. The quiet was overwhelming, and it took a long time to fall asleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like heavy steps moving in the forest around the lake. My heart rate increased. I stayed still in the darkness, listening carefully. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then started again. I tried to remember all the precautions I had taken. The trail was remote, the nearest road was miles away, and I had no way to defend myself beyond a small knife. I could feel my panic rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek out, my hands shaking. The moonlight revealed a movement among the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the figure was upright, moving slowly along the tree line. I froze. My mind raced, thinking through possible scenarios. Bears could stand on their hind legs, but they usually didn't move like that. I stayed as still as possible, watching, hoping it was just my imagination. The figure paused, as if sensing my presence, then continued moving, staying in the shadows. I knew I had to act. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly turned it on, shining the beam toward the figure. There was a sudden rustling, then a low, heavy thud as something hit the underbrush and ran off deeper into the forest. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I quickly zipped the tent back up, sat down on my sleeping bag, and tried to calm my breathing. I knew I had to stay awake until morning, but exhaustion made it almost impossible. I lay there, listening to the night, hearing only the wind and the occasional distant splash in the lake, imagining every possibility of what could be out there. Morning brought some relief. The sun slowly lit the treetops, and the figure from last night was gone. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and packed my day pack for a hike around the lake to explore. Every step I took felt cautious. I inspected the shorelines and forest edges, trying to find any tracks or signs of what I had seen. I found footprints, human footprints, slightly obscured by fallen leaves and pine needles. They were large and heavy, moving along the edge of the lake, heading in the direction I had planned to hike. My unease returned, but I tried to reason with myself. Could be a hunter or another camper, I told myself. It was remote, but not entirely unvisited. I decided to keep moving but changed my route, taking higher trails that overlooked the lake. From there, I could see any movement along the shore. The forest was dense, and the silence was constant except for the wind and the occasional bird. Hours passed. I didn't see anyone. The footprints ended, or they had been covered by wind and leaves. Still, my senses were heightened. Every snapped twig made me tense. I hiked until late afternoon, feeling the fatigue in my legs and shoulders. I returned to camp to rest, light another fire, and prepare food. The sun dropped behind the ridges, shadows grew long, and the chill returned. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, knowing I wouldn't sleep deeply. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I stayed alert, flashlight close at hand. Hours passed with no sign of movement, but the sense of being watched lingered. My mind raced through every scenario, each one more terrifying than the last. The fire eventually burned down to embers, and I used a small camping stove to boil water for warmth. Exhaustion overtook fear slightly, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning came again, and with it, a cautious calm. I packed up camp systematically, checking every corner, ensuring nothing was left behind. I took the lake route back, staying alert, scanning for signs of anyone else. Everything seemed undisturbed. I felt both relief and lingering tension, knowing that the previous night could have been anyone. Another camper, a hunter, or someone with unknown intentions. I kept my pace steady, sticking to visible trails and marking my route mentally. By midday, I reached the stream crossing. The sun was higher, shadows shorter, and the forest seemed less intimidating in the light. I carefully forded the stream again, mindful of slippery rocks. My muscles ached, but my relief was palpable. I continued hiking toward the trailhead, following the same path I had come in on. The isolation felt safer now, with the rising sun and the knowledge that civilization was near. Hours later, I finally reached the end of the trail. The dirt road stretched ahead, and I saw the first distant signs of vehicles. I exhaled a long breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. I stopped, took in the view, and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had survived the isolation, the fear, and the unknown that had haunted me over the last 2 nights. It had been one of the scariest experiences of my life, but also profoundly grounding. The wilderness had reminded me of my own vulnerability, of how easily comfort and safety can vanish, and how careful attention and respect for the environment, and for unknown dangers, can carry you through. I drove back slowly, reliving each moment, from the initial excitement of arrival to the fear of the night, to the cautious relief of morning. I realized that camping in such isolated areas was not something to take lightly. Preparation, awareness, and respect for the environment were crucial. The experience left me more vigilant, more aware of how fragile the sense of security is when removed from the ordinary structures of daily life. And despite the fear, I felt a deep appreciation for the raw, unfiltered reality of nature. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also real, honest, and alive in a way the city could never match. I promised myself I would return to nature, but next time with a companion or at least more advanced preparation. The memory of those 2 nights stayed with me, vivid and clear, a reminder of the thin line between peace and fear, and of how important it is to respect the quiet power of the wild. I knew that no story, no memory, could ever fully capture the feeling of that place. The combination of awe, beauty, and unease. But I carried it with me in every careful step, every breath of fresh air, and every quiet moment of reflection that followed. I survived, I learned, and I left with a renewed sense of perspective on life, safety, and the fragile balance between comfort and the untamed world. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, wanting to escape the city, the constant noise, and the suffocating pressure of work. I had chosen a remote forested area deep in the mountains, a place I had read about in a hiking forum that promised quiet, solitude, and untouched nature. The directions were vague, given only as coordinates, but that added to the allure. I wanted to test myself, to see if I could handle being alone in the wilderness for a full 3 days. I packed carefully: a tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, dehydrated food, plenty of water, a first aid kit, a compass, maps, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I had left my phone mostly unused, only keeping it for emergencies, though I doubted I would have a signal out there. The drive up the mountain was long and winding, the road narrowing and turning into gravel before finally ending at a small, unmarked trailhead. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, with the scent of pine and wet earth mixing with the faint smell of smoke from distant campfires. I parked my car and checked my backpack one last time before setting off down the trail. The sun was already beginning to dip behind the peaks, and the forest ahead was thick and shadowed. The first hour was deceptively easy. The trail was clear, and the slope gentle. Birds chirped overhead, and the sound of a distant stream made the forest feel alive. I kept a steady pace, occasionally stopping to take notes in my small journal about the plants and wildlife I saw. But as I went deeper, the trail became harder to follow. Fallen branches, thick underbrush, and the uneven ground made every step deliberate. I had to watch carefully where I placed my feet. One wrong step could twist an ankle or send me sliding down a muddy slope. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a stream. The ground was flat and dry enough to pitch my tent. I set it up carefully, making sure the lines were taut and the stakes secure. I then gathered wood for a small fire, knowing it would be essential for warmth and for keeping animals at a distance. The fire crackled to life as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and I felt a small sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I had wanted: solitude, quiet, and the chance to survive on my own in the wilderness. Night came quickly. The forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, the soundscape shifting from birdsong to the rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. I ate a simple dinner of dehydrated pasta, heating water over the fire, and kept my flashlight close by. I noticed the forest seemed unusually silent in certain stretches, as though every living thing had retreated. I told myself it was normal. I had read about how animals behave differently at night. Then, around 11 p.m., I heard it. A low, deliberate snapping of a branch somewhere just beyond the stream. It wasn't random. It sounded like something large moving cautiously, almost stalking. My pulse quickened. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, though I hoped it was nothing so large. Still, the sound repeated, softer this time, almost like it was testing me, moving closer and then stopping. I tried to calm myself, making mental notes of what I would do if it was a bear. I had bear spray in my pack, and I knew how to use it. I decided not to make too much noise, but to remain alert. The snapping continued intermittently, the pauses stretching longer than seemed natural, as though whatever was out there was watching, considering, or waiting. I stayed in my tent, listening, feeling the fire behind me like a fragile barrier between safety and whatever was out there. Hours passed. I dozed in fits, waking at every sound. A fox cried in the distance, leaves rustled near the stream, and an owl hooted from a high branch. But the snapping had stopped, replaced by a more subtle presence. The feeling that something was moving around the perimeter of my clearing. I couldn't see it, couldn't pinpoint it, and that was worse than seeing it. My mind started playing tricks, making every shadow seem animate. I checked my gear repeatedly, my hands trembling slightly, my senses hyper-aware. Around 3 a.m., I decided I couldn't stay in the tent. I needed to confirm what was outside. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out, careful to keep my movements quiet. The beam of the light swept across the clearing, the trees, the stream. Nothing moved. No glowing eyes, no silhouette. I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety, not knowing if the absence of sound meant the creature had left or was watching from the darkness. I circled my fire once, shining the light into every nook, and finally returned to the tent. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle, every distant animal sound made me jump. I kept my flashlight within reach and clutched the bear spray. I thought about leaving at first light, but the trail was long, and I knew the forest would be just as dangerous in the dark if I tried to hike out now. So I waited, the hours stretching endlessly. By dawn, the tension didn't lessen, but the light made the forest feel less threatening. I decided to explore the area cautiously, sticking close to the stream. That's when I saw it. Large, human-like footprints in the mud, heading parallel to the stream, away from my campsite. My heart pounded as I examined them. They were bigger than mine, far too large for a deer or bear. The toes were spread in a way that suggested careful walking, deliberate movement, not an animal's gait. I followed them a short distance, making mental notes, then returned to my tent. Whatever had left them was not far, and it was likely still around. I realized then that I was not alone in the forest. Not a bear, not a deer, but another human. Someone else had been moving silently near my campsite, watching, waiting, perhaps even knowing I was there. My fear shifted from wildlife to human danger, which felt more immediate and personal. I packed my belongings quickly, deciding I would move to a different location downstream. I didn't want to confront whoever or whatever had been following me. As I moved, keeping my eyes and ears alert, I noticed other signs. Broken branches at eye level, disturbed underbrush, and more footprints, indicating someone or something had been tracking the stream for hours. My pace quickened, though I tried to stay quiet. I kept thinking about my options. I could continue downstream and try to find a safer clearing, or I could attempt to hike back to the car. But the forest was dense, and I didn't know how long it would take to reach safety without getting lost. Hours passed. I found a small clearing near a bend in the stream that seemed safe enough to rest briefly. I ate some food and drank water, trying to calm my nerves. I kept scanning the forest, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Every shadow, every tree seemed to conceal movement. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was another hiker, someone camping further upstream, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being deliberately watched. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to make my move back toward the trailhead. I followed the stream for guidance, marking my path with small piles of stones to avoid getting lost. The forest was still dense, the terrain rough, but daylight gave me confidence. Occasionally, I would see broken branches or footprints that confirmed I had not been imagining the presence. Whoever had been here was moving cautiously, staying hidden, just as I was trying to stay cautious myself. By early evening, I reached a point where the trees thinned and the forest opened into a more accessible slope. From there, I could see the glint of the trailhead road in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, knowing the feeling of being watched hadn't fully left. I finally reached the road just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. My car was exactly where I had left it. I quickly loaded my gear, keeping my eyes on the treeline, and locked the doors. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't during the day, but safer nonetheless. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every sound from the forest, every shadow on the side of the road, made me flinch. I didn't stop until I reached a small town at the base of the mountains, where there were lights, people, and safety. I parked at a gas station, drank some water, and sat for a long time, trying to calm my nerves. I considered reporting what I had seen, but I had no concrete evidence beyond footprints and the feeling of being watched. Most people would dismiss it as paranoia. In the days that followed, I reflected on the trip. I had survived not because of luck, but because of preparation, caution, and attention to detail. I learned that fear is useful. It keeps you alert, sharp, and ready. I had gone to the forest seeking solitude and adventure, but I came back understanding the fine line between exploration and danger. I had faced the unknown and survived, and that gave me a new respect for the wilderness, for other humans, and for my own instincts. I never went back to that campsite. The forest had left its mark on me, and I knew there were things out there, human and otherwise, that didn't follow the rules I expected. But I also knew I could survive it. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed into caution and awareness, lessons I carried with me long after the trip ended. I had entered the forest alone, uncertain, and left with a profound understanding of both the wilderness and myself. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, and I thought I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. I had chosen a remote section of national forest miles away from any roads or marked trails, one of those areas where a single wrong step could leave you lost, and cell service was practically a rumor. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the kind of solitude that would strip away all distractions. I wanted to feel completely alone with nature. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that solitude could turn into something almost unbearable, and how easily it could make you feel exposed and small in ways you never imagined. The drive out was long, over gravel roads that twisted through dense pine forests, their shadows stretching across the path in late afternoon light. I could see small animals darting through the underbrush and hear the faint rustle of birds in the treetops. But the deeper I went, the quieter it became. By the time I parked at the small clearing I had chosen as my starting point, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I unloaded my gear slowly, checking my backpack twice to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything essential. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, first aid kit, and my flashlight with extra batteries. I had a knife strapped to my belt, and I carried a small folding shovel in case I needed it for fire pits or emergencies. I prided myself on being prepared. I decided to hike a few miles from the clearing to set up camp. I wanted to be tucked away, hidden with a good vantage of the surrounding area. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, twigs, and pine needles, and the smell of damp earth was strong, even though the day had been warm. I passed over small creeks, stepping carefully on moss-covered stones that were slick underfoot. Occasionally, I would hear a distant cracking of branches, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I told myself it was animals, the usual forest life, but as the shadows lengthened, I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing that felt right. It was surrounded by dense brush and tall trees, giving me the cover I wanted. A small stream ran nearby, which would be useful for water, though I knew I needed to boil it first. I started by clearing the ground for my tent, removing sticks and rocks and making the area as flat as possible. The light was beginning to fade, the forest growing dim and heavy. By the time I had my tent up and my sleeping bag inside, the last rays of the sun were disappearing behind the trees. I built a small fire in the cleared area, careful to surround it with stones. The forest around me was almost unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small noise, like the snapping of a twig or the rustle of leaves, feel louder than it should. I cooked a small meal, dehydrated food that only needed boiling water, and tried to shake off the creeping unease that had started to set in. Once I was done, I put out most of the fire, leaving only a small ember to provide a faint glow. Darkness fell quickly, and soon the only light came from the weak beam of my flashlight. The first few hours of night passed uneventfully. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to read a book, but the text blurred as my mind wandered. Every now and then, I would hear something moving outside the tent. Most of the time, I convinced myself it was a small animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard something that didn't fit any animal I knew. A low, deliberate crunching sound, like someone stepping on dead leaves, moving slowly in circles around my tent. My heart rate spiked, but I stayed still, not wanting to give away my presence if someone, or something, was out there. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just a branch falling, a deer moving quietly. I tried to sleep, but the darkness felt thicker than usual, pressing down on me. Around midnight, I heard it again, crunching, closer this time, deliberate. I unzipped the tent slightly and shone my flashlight around the clearing. There was nothing, just the shadows of trees and underbrush. I felt my pulse in my ears, every muscle in my body tense. I had packed a small handgun for emergencies, though I hoped I would never need it. I reached for it and held it across my chest, trying to convince myself that I was being cautious, not paranoid. The forest was still, almost too still, as if it were holding its breath along with me. The wind had died down, leaving only the occasional drip of condensation from the leaves. Then I heard a voice. Not a real voice, but a sound. A whispering that seemed to come from all around me. I froze. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the night sounds, but it became clearer. A low, guttural muttering, impossible to understand, but distinctly human. Panic hit me in a way I had never experienced before. I zipped up the tent as quickly as I could, pulling my sleeping bag over my shoulders. I wanted to leave, but I knew I couldn't just run blindly into the forest in the dark. My only option was to wait, keep quiet, and hope whatever was out there wasn't close. My mind raced with possibilities, other campers, poachers, someone dangerous. I had heard stories about isolated forests and people who waited for unsuspecting hikers. Hours passed. I didn't move. Every small noise made my heart leap. A branch snapping, a stone rolling down the hillside. Even my own breathing felt loud. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the side of my tent, just beyond the thin fabric. I pressed my back against the wall of the tent and held my knife in front of me, willing myself to stay calm. By the time dawn began to creep through the trees, I was exhausted, jittery, and barely able to hold my flashlight steady. I unzipped the tent cautiously and looked around. There were footprints in the soft earth around my clearing. They were large, heavy, and human. I swallowed hard and tried to trace their path, but they disappeared into the forest. My stomach turned over. Whoever or whatever had been circling my tent had been watching me. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I packed up quickly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I left my fire pit cold, my supplies untouched. My plan was simple: get out of there, reach the main trail, and never look back. As I moved, I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for more footprints or signs that someone was following me. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every shadow, every flicker of movement made my heart jump. I followed the stream I had noticed the day before, hoping it would lead me to the main trail. Hours passed. My legs burned. My pack felt heavier with every step, and my mouth was dry from tension and fear. I kept imagining someone stepping out from the trees, but I never saw anyone. Still, I moved cautiously, making sure I could defend myself if needed. By mid-morning, I stumbled onto a faint trail, one that was more well-worn and familiar than the path I had originally taken. Relief hit me like a wave. I followed the trail for several miles, and eventually, I came across a small ranger station. The building was quiet, but I saw a truck parked outside and a few people moving around. I approached, exhausted and shaken, and explained to the ranger what had happened. They listened carefully, noting the footprints and the details I had observed. They told me it wasn't uncommon to have illegal hunters or trespassers in remote sections of the forest, and that I had likely stumbled into one of their areas. They offered me a ride back to my car, and I accepted gratefully. As we drove out, I looked back at the forest, still dense, still quiet, and I realized just how vulnerable I had been. The isolation I had sought had become the very thing that terrified me. By the time I reached my car, I was physically drained, emotionally raw, but relieved. I knew I had survived because I stayed calm, stayed aware, and didn't take unnecessary risks. That experience changed the way I approached camping forever. I continued to love the wilderness, but I learned to respect it in ways I hadn't before. I always made sure someone knew exactly where I was going, carried extra safety equipment, and avoided areas where I couldn't see other signs of human activity. The forest had reminded me that solitude could be dangerous, and that the most frightening moments aren't always about monsters. They're about how exposed and small you feel when real danger is close and you're utterly alone. Even months later, I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and feel the same knot of fear I had felt in that tent, remembering the heavy crunching outside my temporary shelter, the feeling of being watched, the footprints disappearing into the forest. But those memories, though frightening, reminded me that I had survived. They reminded me that I could remain calm, think clearly, and get through even the most unnerving, realistic dangers the wilderness could throw at me. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea of leaving the city behind, of being completely alone in the forest for a few days, had consumed me. I wanted solitude, a break from work, from the noise, from people. I had chosen a remote part of the national forest, far from any marked trails, where cell service was almost non-existent and the land was wild, untamed, and dense. I packed carefully: a small tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, canned food, water bottles, a flashlight, batteries, a knife, a first aid kit, and a compass. I even brought a small handsaw and rope. Everything seemed over-prepared, but I wanted to be ready for anything. I started hiking mid-morning, leaving my car at a gravel pullout a few miles from the main road. The forest was thick, towering pines and oaks everywhere, their roots twisting out of the earth like the veins of the land itself. The ground was uneven, covered in moss, fallen leaves, and the occasional slippery patch of wet soil from the morning dew. I followed an old logging trail that I had found on a topographic map. It was faint, overgrown in parts, and hardly used. The air smelled fresh, earthy, slightly damp. Birds chirped intermittently, squirrels rustled through the brush, and somewhere in the distance, the low gurgle of a stream could be heard. The sunlight filtered through the trees in thin beams, painting the forest floor in shifting patches of gold and shadow. I felt at ease, alone, safe. The sense of isolation was exhilarating. I set up camp in a small clearing by a stream in the early afternoon. It was perfect. Flat ground, enough room for my tent, a small fire pit already dug out by some previous campers, and water within reach. I set up my tent carefully, securing it against the wind, and stacked my firewood. I made a small dinner on my stove, canned beans with some rice. The warmth of the food, the sound of the stream, and the cool air made everything feel like it had slowed down in time. The forest was alive but distant, a world of its own that I could watch safely from my small clearing. Night came gradually. The forest changed as the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched long, and the sounds of daytime creatures quieted, replaced by insects, owls, and the distant howls of coyotes. I made a small fire, its light flickering across the trees. I sat close, the warmth soaking into my bones. My flashlight rested on my lap, a constant reassurance. I checked my supplies, made sure the knife was within reach, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, a rustling sound woke me. I froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The sound was coming from just beyond the clearing, near the denser trees, something moving deliberately but quietly. I held my breath, trying to figure out what it could be. Animals were normal, deer, raccoons, or coyotes, but this felt different, larger. The rustling paused, then began again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, sweeping slowly. The beam cut through the darkness but showed nothing. Then it moved again, faster this time, something large moving between the trees. My heart rate spiked. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. I picked up a thick branch from the ground, holding it like a weapon. The fire crackled, throwing sharp shadows that made the shapes in the trees harder to interpret. I stayed still, listening. The rustling didn't stop. Instead, I began to hear something else, breathing low and deliberate, coming from just past the edge of the firelight. I could feel the weight of eyes on me. Panic bubbled up, but I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself it could be a bear. Bears were common in this area, and the smell of my food could have drawn one near. I carefully reached into my backpack for my bear spray, keeping my eyes on the trees. The breathing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Then, I heard a faint snapping of a branch, very close now. My flashlight beam caught a shape, large, dark, moving cautiously. It was too big to be a deer, and the way it moved didn't feel like a coyote. My stomach dropped. I backed up slowly toward my tent, keeping the branch in one hand and bear spray in the other. The firelight flickered, and in one instant, I saw it clearly. A man wearing dark clothing crouched just at the edge of the clearing. His movements were careful, deliberate, almost predatory. He was watching me. My mind raced. How did someone get out here? How long had he been there? I felt trapped. I couldn't see any path to run safely. My only option was to stay calm and make him aware that I was armed. I shook the branch slightly, letting it rattle against a rock. The man flinched, then crouched lower, disappearing into the shadows. My fire was dying down, but I couldn't leave it. I threw another log on it, letting it flare. The light showed nothing. He was gone, at least for now. I spent the rest of the night in a tight ball inside my tent, flashlight on, knife under my pillow, and bear spray by my side. Every sound made me jump. The wind through the trees, a branch cracking, leaves rustling. I kept imagining him circling, waiting, watching. Sleep didn't come. By dawn, the forest looked harmless again. The sun pierced through the trees, birds chirped, and the world seemed normal. But I couldn't shake the fear. I had no idea who that man was or what he wanted. I made a plan. Pack everything quickly and leave before he came back. As I packed, I stayed alert. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call felt amplified. I stuffed the sleeping bag and tent into my backpack as quickly as possible, making sure to leave nothing behind. The fire had burned out, leaving a pile of ash. I poured water over it to ensure nothing could flare up while I left. When I started hiking back, I chose a different route. The trail was less defined, overgrown, but I kept moving, always looking behind me, always listening. I wasn't sure how far he had been following, if he had even moved last night, or if he was still out there. The forest suddenly felt enormous. Every tree a potential hiding place, every shadow a threat. I kept going for hours, stopping only when I had a clear line of sight. I tried to stay calm, rational, telling myself that most people wouldn't be here, that someone like him would have left. But the fear stayed with me, gnawing. My legs were tired, my pack heavy, my mind exhausted. Finally, after what felt like endless hiking, I reached a more maintained trail and then the gravel road. My heart lifted slightly when I saw my car in the distance. I ran the last stretch, not daring to look back. Once I reached it, I locked the doors and sat inside for several minutes, shaking, trying to process what had happened. I called the local ranger station and reported the encounter, describing the location, the man, and the events. They promised to send someone to check the area. I didn't wait around to see if they would. I drove back slowly, constantly scanning the sides of the road. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow made me tense, but I kept moving until I was safely back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars, other people, the normalcy of the world. When I finally reached home, I took a long shower, washing off the sweat, dirt, and fear. The sense of being watched lingered, but I reminded myself I was safe. I realized that camping, even in the wilderness, carries risks beyond wildlife. Humans could be just as dangerous. I slept fitfully that night, but with the morning, I felt relief. I had survived, and I had learned to respect the forest not just as a place of beauty, but as a place where vigilance was essential. I never returned to that spot. Months later, I read a news report about a man arrested for stalking hikers in that area. He had been following people for days, waiting for the right moment. I recognized the description immediately. I felt a deep, lingering chill thinking about how close I had come. But I also felt a strange sense of closure. I had trusted my instincts, stayed calm, and survived. That experience changed the way I approached the wilderness forever. No longer with reckless excitement, but with respect, caution, and a deep awareness that danger often comes when you least expect it. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but this trip felt different from the start. The area I chose was deep in the backwoods, far from any town or main road. The drive there had been long, the kind where the landscape slowly changes from populated roads to dense forests, the trees growing taller and thicker, casting shadows across the road even in daylight. By the time I reached the trailhead, the air had grown colder, sharper, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The parking area was small, barely more than a dirt clearing surrounded by pine and oak trees, and I could already sense how quiet this place was. There were no other cars, no sign of anyone else. That was fine. I liked solitude, but I didn't know how quickly it would turn from peaceful to tense. I carried my backpack, heavy with essentials. A small stove, food, water, first aid supplies, flashlight, extra batteries, and a sleeping bag. I also had my hiking boots laced tightly and my jacket zipped to the top. I knew the forest could be unforgiving, especially if the weather changed. The trail I chose was steep and winding, leading to a clearing where I intended to set up my tent near a small creek. I had hiked this route on a map before, but I had never actually walked it. I had told myself it was an adventure, the kind where you test yourself, your senses, and your patience. The hike began pleasantly enough. The forest smelled rich and earthy, the soil damp from a rainstorm earlier that week. Birds were chirping, squirrels moved quickly among the branches, and the creek's sound grew louder as I approached it. The first 2 hours passed without incident. I kept a steady pace, taking breaks to drink water and eat small snacks. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no cell signal and no sounds of distant roads or humans. The only noises were the forest's natural ones. The creek, the wind through the trees, and my own boots crunching against fallen leaves and twigs. I reached the clearing just before sunset. It was the perfect spot. Flat ground, a small fire pit already made, and the creek running nearby. I set up my tent carefully, driving stakes into the soil and securing the rainfly. I laid out my sleeping bag and unpacked some food for a simple dinner. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when I noticed something strange. About 50 feet away, just beyond the line of trees, I could see faint tracks in the soft soil. Large footprints, not human, with a shape I couldn't immediately identify. They were fresh, the soil slightly damp, pressed down recently. My stomach tightened. My mind began to race with possibilities. Bears were known to roam in these parts, but the prints didn't quite match the ones I had studied in the guidebooks. They were bigger, longer, and oddly spaced. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a large dog or a deer. Still, I stayed alert. I lit a small fire to cook my dinner. The flames crackled and gave warmth as the light began to fade, and I was glad for it. Darkness always seemed heavier in these woods, denser than I remembered, more silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I ate slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the forest's edge. Not loud, but distinct, deliberate. I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. The growl repeated, longer this time, a deep sound that vibrated through the clearing. My first thought was a bear. My stomach clenched. I had seen bears before in parks and documentaries. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and fast. I scanned the tree line, the shadows moving as if something were circling, always just out of full view. I finished eating, my hands trembling slightly, and decided to stay close to the fire. I knew bears usually avoid humans if they can smell food elsewhere, but these weren't ordinary circumstances. The tracks and the growl made it clear that something large was nearby. I kept a small knife within reach, more for peace of mind than actual defense. I lay awake for hours, staring into the flickering firelight, listening to the forest's noises. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch under unseen weight made my heart jump. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the firelight, a shadow slipping between the trees. The night stretched endlessly. I tried to sleep but couldn't, my mind refusing to quiet. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. I could hear the creek more clearly now, the water flowing faster, almost violently in its rocky bed. I could hear the wind shifting, carrying smells from unknown directions. And then I heard something worse. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the underbrush, circling my clearing. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, listening as they moved closer and then further away, over and over like a predator testing me, sizing me up. By dawn, I was exhausted. I had slept only in 10-minute bursts, curled up near the fire to keep warm. When the first light broke through the trees, I finally dared to look around. The footprints had multiplied. They weren't just around the clearing. They had gone down the creek, into the woods, leaving a messy trail in the wet soil. I traced them carefully, trying to understand their origin. The prints were enormous, longer than a human foot wide, clawed. My stomach sank. I realized I wasn't dealing with a normal bear. Something else was moving in these woods, something I didn't want to encounter up close. I decided to break camp immediately. Every movement was slow and careful, listening for any signs that the creature was near. I packed everything efficiently, leaving no food scraps behind. I followed the trail back to the main path, staying alert. The forest seemed quieter in the daylight, but the sense of being watched persisted. I kept scanning the shadows, my senses hyper-aware of every movement. Every bird that took flight startled me. Every twig snap made me freeze. Hours passed. I moved quickly but cautiously, following the trail I had come in on. The sun was high, warming the forest, but I didn't feel safer. At one point, I had to cross the creek where the trail had washed out. I balanced carefully on rocks, gripping a branch for stability. That's when I saw it. A massive set of prints leading straight across the creek, larger than any bear I had ever seen, clawed and deep in the mud. My heart pounded, and I realized the creature must have followed me during the night, keeping just beyond the firelight. The thought made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to keep moving. Panic would only slow me down. I reached the parking area by late afternoon. The car was a welcome sight, a barrier between me and the forest. I loaded my gear frantically, scanning the trees as I did. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. Even though I had no intention of leaving immediately, I just needed to gather my thoughts, to breathe. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest receded, dense and dark. I could see a shadow among the trees, tall and unmoving, watching me. I didn't look back after that. That trip changed the way I viewed the wilderness. I learned to respect the forest in ways I hadn't before, to understand that sometimes isolation comes with dangers that aren't obvious at first glance. I never went back to that clearing. Later, I reported the tracks to park authorities. They examined them and concluded that it might have been a very large black bear, older than usual, aggressive, and possibly accustomed to moving near humans. They confirmed there were no known reports of attacks, but the area had been closed temporarily for safety. In the end, I survived because I stayed alert, because I respected the signs around me, and because I didn't take unnecessary risks. The forest was still beautiful, still inviting, but I understood the fine line between adventure and danger, and I never camped alone so far into the backwoods again. Even now, years later, I can remember the sound of those footsteps in the night, the shadow moving just beyond the firelight, and the pure, raw fear of knowing that something powerful, unseen, was nearby, watching me, waiting. The summer had been unusually hot that year, and I felt the need to escape the city, the suffocating streets, and the constant hum of traffic and human noise. I had chosen a spot deep in the mountains, somewhere I had never been before. The map I had found online showed a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forests, near a river that wasn't marked on most maps. I had read a few online posts about it, all of them brief, vague, and full of warnings about how remote it was, how easy it was to get lost. That was exactly what I wanted: loneliness, the kind of quiet you can't get in the city, the kind that makes you feel your own thoughts echo back at you. I packed my gear meticulously, making sure I had more than enough water and food, extra batteries, a proper first aid kit, and even a handheld GPS device. I had learned from past mistakes that being underprepared in the wilderness is unforgiving. By the time I left the car and started hiking into the forest, the sun was high, and the heat pressed down on me. I could feel the sweat soaking through my shirt as I trudged along the narrow dirt trail, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. The trail wasn't well-trodden. In some areas, it was barely visible, swallowed up by pine needles and underbrush. Birds were the only sounds around me, a few insects buzzing, and the distant hum of the river somewhere ahead. I could smell the dry earth and pine sap, a mixture that made me feel both alive and isolated. After a few hours, the trail split, and I consulted the GPS. It indicated that the clearing I was aiming for was just over a small ridge. I decided to follow a faint path that veered off to the left, descending slightly toward the river I could hear below. When I arrived at the clearing, I realized it was more beautiful than I had imagined. The ground was flat and covered in soft moss, the river glinting in the afternoon sunlight as it wound through the trees. A few fallen logs were scattered around, perfect for sitting or making a fire. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the river but far enough not to risk flooding if the water rose. I gathered wood for a fire, arranging it carefully in a small pit I dug. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. As night approached, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit the fire, feeling the warmth and the small sense of control it gave me. I ate a simple meal, the kind that required little cooking, and watched the river reflect the changing colors of the sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. The sound of snapping branches from deeper in the forest, far enough away that I couldn't see anything, but close enough that I could hear it clearly. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Deer or a raccoon, perhaps. The snapping continued intermittently, slow and deliberate. I checked my surroundings carefully. The forest looked empty, and the shadows made every tree seem like it was leaning closer. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just nerves, the kind that come from being alone in the wilderness. I made my way to the river to fill my water container, staying close to the firelight so I wouldn't feel completely blind. As I bent down to scoop water, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow, shifting unnaturally. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The forest swallowed it up again. Night fell fully, and the temperature dropped further. I wrapped myself in a thick sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but the sounds of the forest made it impossible. There was the constant rush of the river, the wind through the pine needles, and that snapping sound that never completely stopped. It was always somewhere out there, moving, waiting. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a pack of wolves, but a rational part of me knew that wolves and bears usually avoided humans. Around midnight, the snapping grew louder, closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs, the occasional rustle of underbrush. I sat up in my tent, my flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Then I heard something else, a low, guttural sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't a growl or a howl, not something I had heard before. It was human-like but distorted, as if someone was breathing heavily through a mask. My heart began to race. I grabbed my backpack, checking my supplies. I had a knife, a flashlight, and my GPS, which I could use to retrace my steps if I needed to leave quickly. The sound came again, closer this time, moving around the edge of the clearing. I debated running but realized I didn't know which way was safe. The forest was dark and unfamiliar, and the last thing I wanted was to stumble into something worse. I stayed low, watching, listening. Hours passed like this, each snap of a branch making me flinch, each rustle in the leaves sending my heart into my throat. I thought I could hear footsteps circling the clearing. I held my flashlight tightly, shining it into the darkness. The beam caught a movement, something tall, hunched, moving deliberately between the trees. I held my breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I could see now that it was a person, wearing dark clothing that blended into the shadows, carrying something that reflected the light. A metal object, maybe an axe or a machete. Panic set in. I realized I had no idea why this person was here or what they wanted. My rational mind screamed at me to stay calm, but my body betrayed me. I had to think. I couldn't outrun them if they were already nearby, and I couldn't confront them. The safest option was to hide and wait for daylight, or at least until I could figure out a way to get to my car safely. I crawled quietly out of my tent, staying low behind the logs I had set around the fire. The firelight flickered, illuminating patches of the clearing. I could hear the person moving carefully, almost methodically, circling the area. They stopped occasionally, making soft noises as if listening. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't spot me. The night felt endless. Each hour stretched into a minute, each sound magnified in the darkness. At one point, I thought I heard them step directly behind one of the logs near me. I froze, my body rigid with fear. They lingered there for a long moment, then moved away. I didn't dare move until I was sure they had left the clearing entirely. Finally, before dawn, the forest fell silent. The river's sound was the only thing left, flowing calmly as if nothing had happened. I waited until the first rays of sunlight pierced the trees, illuminating the clearing in pale gold. I could see the footprints in the dirt, large and deliberate, circling my tent and the fire pit. They weren't fresh anymore, but the memory of them made my stomach churn. I knew I had to leave. I packed my tent and supplies as quickly and quietly as possible, avoiding any unnecessary noise. I followed the path I had taken, sticking to the faint trail and using the GPS to guide me. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening but still tense. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, but I kept moving. Hours later, I emerged onto a dirt road that led back to civilization. I could see my car in the distance, parked under a small stand of trees. Relief flooded me, but I remained vigilant, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The road was empty, the forest silent, and no one followed me. I reached the car and locked the doors, taking a deep breath as I sat inside. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. I started the engine and drove away, the forest disappearing behind me. When I finally returned home, I reported the incident to local authorities, describing the person I had seen and the strange behavior. They said they would patrol the area more frequently, but there was little more they could do without evidence. I learned later that the forest had a reputation for people living off-grid, sometimes violent, and that hikers and campers occasionally encountered them. The thought that I had narrowly escaped one of these people stayed with me for weeks. In the following months, I refused to camp in remote areas. The experience taught me the limits of preparedness and the importance of situational awareness. I realized that nature itself isn't always the danger. People can be far more unpredictable, far more threatening. I kept my equipment ready, my maps updated, and I always made sure someone knew where I was going. I never forgot the fear that night in the forest, the silent threat that stalked me, and the relief that came with finally stepping out of the shadows and back into safety. The memory of the snapping branches, the distorted breathing, the shadowy figure lurking just beyond the firelight never left me completely. But I survived. I had faced something I couldn't control, something that was neither natural nor supernatural, and I had come out the other side. It was a lesson in caution, vigilance, and respect for the unknown elements of both wilderness and human nature. That summer, the mountains tested me, but I returned stronger, wiser, and painfully aware of how fragile safety can be. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: get away from the city, leave the stress and noise behind, and spend a few days alone in the forest. I wanted to be completely self-sufficient, carry only what I could manage on my back, and live as simply as possible. I was tired of schedules, tired of people, tired of everything. The forest promised a kind of silence that the city could never give, a quiet so deep it almost pressed against your ears. I had chosen a remote spot, far from roads, far from anyone else, because I wanted that kind of isolation. I told myself it was about testing myself, about seeing if I could survive on my own, but I also knew I craved something more primal, a raw, unfiltered experience of being completely alone in nature. The hike in was tougher than I expected. I had a map, but the trails were not well marked. I followed faint paths, crossing small streams, climbing over rocks, and slipping on wet leaves more times than I could count. The sun was still high when I finally found a clearing that looked suitable. It was small but flat, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides and a steep slope on the 4th. It had a little stream running nearby, which meant water, and there was enough dry ground for a fire. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. I set my backpack down and started unpacking. I had brought a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a compass, and a flashlight. I also carried a small hatchet and a folding knife just in case. Everything was carefully packed to minimize weight, but still, after the long hike, my shoulders and legs ached. Setting up the tent was a relief. The fabric felt soft against my fingers as I hammered in the stakes, and I could hear the stream murmuring in the background. Once the tent was up, I walked along the clearing's edge, inspecting the area. There were signs of wildlife. Deer tracks in the mud, broken branches where squirrels had been climbing, and a few bird feathers caught on the low branches. The forest seemed alive but calm. I gathered some dry wood for a fire and stacked it carefully, knowing that a fire would not only provide warmth but also a sense of security once night fell. I ate a small meal and drank some water, feeling exhausted but strangely alert, like every sound and shadow held meaning. I had always thought I knew how to be alone in nature, but this felt different. It felt real. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I started the fire. The flames crackled and spat tiny sparks, and the warmth was immediate. The forest darkened around me, the shadows stretching long and thin. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and the low hum of insects preparing for night. The first night was tense, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in months. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke several times that night to strange sounds. The wind was blowing hard, shaking the trees, and something heavy seemed to pass by just outside the clearing. I could hear it brushing against branches, walking on the undergrowth. My heart raced each time, but when I shined my flashlight into the dark, I saw nothing. It could have been a deer, a bear, or just the wind moving loose branches. I told myself not to panic. I was alone, yes, but I was cautious, prepared, experienced. Yet, despite my rational mind, a gnawing unease settled in my stomach. Something about the forest at night felt different than I expected, more alive in a way that made me hyper-aware of every detail. Morning brought a fragile sense of relief. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of light on the forest floor. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed calmer. I ate breakfast and decided to explore the nearby area. There was a narrow path along the stream that led deeper into the forest. I walked slowly, scanning for both beauty and danger. Birds sang and insects buzzed, but the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees were older, denser, their roots twisting in unpredictable patterns. Moss-covered rocks and fallen logs, making each step uncertain. I noticed animal tracks again, larger ones this time, ones that could only belong to something heavy. I had seen bear tracks before, but these were unusually deep and fresh. My stomach tightened. I considered turning back, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what was out there, even if it made me nervous. By the afternoon, I had found a small, overgrown path that seemed rarely used. The underbrush was thick, and I had to push branches aside to pass. Suddenly, I heard a crack behind me. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't like an animal moving. It was deliberate, like someone or something was following me. I turned slowly, scanning the dense foliage. Nothing. My pulse quickened. I had read about hikers getting lost or encountering poachers, but I had never been in a situation that felt genuinely threatening. I backtracked slowly, making noise to let anything nearby know I was present. The sounds behind me stopped, and I breathed a little easier. I reminded myself that bears or wolves usually avoid humans. Still, the uncertainty stayed with me. That night, I decided to reinforce my camp. I moved the tent closer to the stream, cleared extra branches that could fall, and built a taller fire. I used stones to create a crude perimeter and positioned my flashlight near the tent entrance, ready in case I needed it. I cooked a small meal and drank water, trying to stay calm. Darkness came quickly. The forest seemed heavier this night, more suffocating. Sounds that had seemed normal before now felt threatening. A branch snapping in the distance, the howl of a coyote, the distant thump of something moving. Each made me sit up, flashlight in hand, listening. My imagination ran wild, but I forced myself to stay rational. Still, sleep was nearly impossible. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. The third day brought a strange mix of relief and apprehension. I had slept more soundly after keeping the fire going all night and staying alert. I spent the morning repairing small things in camp, checking water supplies, and walking along the stream. I noticed more tracks around the area. Not just deer or squirrels, but something heavier, deeper, and closer to human size. At first, I told myself it was a bear, but the spacing of the footprints seemed odd. I checked them carefully. They were larger than mine, wider than a bear's paw, but not exactly human. I couldn't identify them. Anxiety started building. I considered leaving, but the nearest road was a good day's hike away, and I had come too far to abandon the experience. So I stayed, but I stayed vigilant. Late that afternoon, I heard the first unmistakable human sound. A shout, muffled, coming from far in the forest. My stomach twisted. I was alone, and no one was supposed to be around. The sound came again, a long, harsh yell. I grabbed my hatchet and moved toward higher ground to see if I could spot anything. From the ridge, I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but then I realized it was moving strangely, deliberately avoiding open ground. My pulse accelerated. This person or people knew I was here. I didn't know why, but I felt my isolation turn into a tangible danger. I returned to camp, hiding as best as I could behind trees and rocks, keeping the fire low. The figure didn't approach directly, but I knew it was watching. I couldn't see their face, couldn't hear them clearly, but the presence was undeniable. I felt trapped, small, exposed. I spent the night in a tense vigilance, keeping my fire burning and my flashlight close. Every sound startled me. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling, shadows moving. I slept in short bursts, always ready to grab the hatchet or run if necessary. By morning, I had decided I couldn't risk staying. I packed quickly, methodically, making sure nothing was left behind. I took only essentials, leaving heavier supplies in the hope of returning another time. The hike out was exhausting, the forest suddenly menacing. I moved quietly, scanning constantly. Any movement in the trees or bushes made my heart race. I followed the stream as much as possible, hoping it would lead to a more visible trail. Hours passed. I encountered no one, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I stopped only to rest briefly, always listening, always alert. By late afternoon, I finally emerged from the dense forest onto a rough service road. Relief hit me like a wave. My body ached. My back and legs were sore, but the danger I had felt in the forest lifted. I saw the first car pass in hours, a real sign of civilization. I followed the road until it connected to the main highway. Eventually, I found a small town, stopped at a diner, and called for a ride back home. I felt like I had crossed a threshold, moving from a raw, isolated wilderness into the familiarity of society. The experience had tested my endurance, my focus, and my instincts. I had been alone, surrounded by the vast forest, and confronted with uncertainty and danger I had never expected. And I had survived. That clarity, that sense of accomplishment, made every ache and every moment of fear worth it. Looking back, the trip was more than a camping experience. It was a lesson in awareness, preparation, and resilience. I had learned how fragile safety could feel when isolation met unpredictability. I had been careful, but I had also faced the raw unpredictability of the natural world and human presence. I knew I would return to the forest one day, but differently, better prepared, more cautious, more aware. I understood now that nature was beautiful but indifferent, that being alone amplified both wonder and fear, and that survival wasn't about heroics. It was about observation, calm, and action. I carried the memory of that forest, of the sounds and shadows, as a reminder that danger is often unseen, and preparation and respect are the only shields we truly have. I had been planning the camping trip for months, carefully mapping out every step, making sure I had all the gear I needed. I wanted to get away from the city for a few days, to disconnect from the endless noise and the constant demands. I found a small, secluded forest park, about 3 hours' drive from my home. From what I had read online, the place wasn't heavily visited, and it had a network of trails that led deep into the woods. The park was surrounded by mountains on one side and a river that cut through the valley on the other. It seemed perfect, a quiet, untouched wilderness where I could hike, fish, and sleep under the stars. I packed my backpack carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food for 3 days, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. I included a hatchet, a flashlight, and a large pocket knife. I also carried a couple of small bear spray canisters just in case. I checked my gear several times before leaving to make sure nothing was missing. I wanted to be completely prepared. The drive to the park was long but peaceful. I watched the city skyline disappear behind me, replaced by rolling hills and dense forest. By the time I arrived at the park entrance, it was late morning. The ranger station was deserted, but there were maps posted on a bulletin board. I studied them carefully, noting the main trails and a few secondary paths that were less traveled. I chose one of the lesser-used trails, hoping to avoid any other campers. The trail started gently, winding along the edge of the forest. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating patterns on the ground. Birds sang, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush suggested small animals moving about. I felt a sense of calm and excitement as I hiked deeper into the woods. I was completely alone, and it felt liberating. By midday, I had hiked several miles. The trail became steeper as it climbed into the mountains. I paused to drink water and eat a small snack. Looking around, I could see distant ridges and a small stream down below. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I continued on, enjoying the solitude. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a flat clearing surrounded by tall pines. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I unpacked my tent and started assembling it. The ground was soft and covered in a thick layer of pine needles. I chose a spot a few feet away from the trees, giving enough space for a fire pit and to avoid falling branches. I gathered some dry wood and small twigs to start a fire later in the evening. As the sun began to dip, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer, and the sounds of the daytime animals faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of night creatures. I started a small fire in the pit, enjoying the warmth and light. I cooked a simple dinner on my camping stove, then sat by the fire, sipping water and listening to the forest around me. The night was quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. After eating, I crawled into my tent and unrolled my sleeping bag. I planned to sleep early to be ready for a long hike the next morning. But as the night deepened, I started noticing noises that made my stomach tighten. At first, it was just the normal sounds of the forest. Branches snapping under the weight of an animal, leaves rustling in the wind. But then I heard something different. A slow, deliberate crunching sound, like someone walking on the forest floor far away, then stopping, then moving again. I froze, listening carefully. The sound didn't come in a pattern like a deer or a coyote would make. It seemed heavier, slower, and more cautious. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire's light cast shadows around the clearing, but I couldn't see anyone. I stayed quiet, straining to hear. The noise had stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving quietly. I reminded myself that I had bear spray and a hatchet. Still, the unease lingered. I decided to stay awake a little longer, keeping the fire going, listening for any other sounds. Hours passed. The wind rustled the trees, making the shadows dance. The occasional snap of a branch made me tense, my hand hovering over the hatchet. I eventually fell into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke suddenly to the sound of something moving very close to my tent. The soft, deliberate crunching I had heard earlier was now much nearer, circling the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hear the sound of footsteps stepping on dry pine needles just a few feet away. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. My mind raced through possibilities: wild animals, other campers, someone with bad intentions. I remembered the flashlight in my pack. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had almost burned down to embers, and the darkness of the forest was thick. I couldn't see anything clearly. Then, a shadow moved near the edge of the clearing. It was large, humanoid, and cautious. My stomach dropped. I quickly weighed my options. I could confront whoever or whatever it was with the hatchet and bear spray, but that would be dangerous. The safest option seemed to be retreating quietly. I grabbed my backpack, trying to make as little noise as possible, and carefully stepped out of the tent. My plan was to slip down the trail I had come from and find a safer spot closer to the river, where I could stay until daylight. The forest was dark, and moving quietly was harder than I imagined. Every step on the pine needles and twigs sounded loud to me. The shadow moved again, closer this time. I froze behind a large tree, heart racing, and held my breath. It stayed still for a moment, then seemed to move back toward the treeline. I decided to take the chance and slipped along the path, keeping low. I walked for what felt like hours, carefully avoiding open spaces. The forest seemed endless, the trail barely visible in the dim light. My flashlight battery was low, but I used it sparingly, just enough to see obstacles. Eventually, I reached the river. The sound of flowing water was comforting, masking my footsteps. I found a small area behind some bushes and rocks where I could rest. By the time dawn started to break, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and tense. I stayed hidden, listening, waiting for daylight. The forest seemed quieter now, the shadows retreating with the sun. When the first rays filtered through the trees, I cautiously looked around. The clearing where I had camped was empty. Whatever had been there the night before was gone. I decided to follow the river downstream. It seemed safer than retracing my steps through the forest where I had encountered the shadow. The water gave me direction and a source of hydration. I drank sparingly, using my water filter when possible, and moved steadily. As the day progressed, I encountered signs of recent human activity. Discarded wrappers, a faint trail of footprints. It reassured me that I wasn't alone in the world, and that eventually I would reach safety. After several hours, I reached a dirt road that led out of the forest. I could see a distant farmhouse and eventually a small town in the valley. I kept walking until I found a gas station where I could call for a ride. I gave a full account of the area to the local ranger service, describing the forest, the trail, and the shadow I had seen. They were concerned and agreed to send someone to investigate the trail and the clearing. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how unprepared I had been for the dangers of being alone in the wilderness at night. The forest was beautiful and peaceful during the day, but at night it was unpredictable. I learned the importance of staying aware of my surroundings, being ready to retreat, and respecting the power of nature. In the weeks following the trip, I returned to the park, but I never ventured on that remote trail again. I stuck to the more frequented paths and always made sure someone knew exactly where I would be. The fear I had felt that night stayed with me for a long time, a reminder that even in familiar surroundings, the wilderness can be dangerous. I came away from that trip with a new sense of caution and respect. I knew I was lucky to have escaped unharmed. I also carried with me a stronger understanding of my own limits, the importance of preparation, of listening to instinct, and of moving cautiously when alone. The forest had tested me, and I had survived, but I had also learned that nature, while beautiful and serene, demanded vigilance, patience, and awareness. From that day on, I approached camping and hiking differently. I always planned my routes meticulously, checked weather conditions, carried extra safety gear, and informed someone of my itinerary. I avoided traveling alone in remote areas at night, and I stayed alert to sounds, shadows, and movement. I realized that fear in the wilderness was not just a feeling. It was a tool for survival, a signal to move carefully and respect the unknown. The memory of that night never faded, but I used it to grow wiser. I never saw the figure again, and I never knew if it had been another camper, a lost hiker, or something else entirely. The uncertainty remained, but I learned to live with it, using it as a lesson rather than letting it paralyze me. Over time, I became more confident in my abilities, better at reading the forest, and more attuned to its rhythms. That camping trip had started as an escape, a way to enjoy solitude and nature, but it became a profound lesson in survival, awareness, and respect for the wilderness. I returned home safe, wiser, and with a new appreciation for the fragile balance between adventure and danger. The forest had tested me in ways I hadn't expected, but I had endured, and in that endurance, I found clarity, resilience, and a lasting respect for the wild world.